at Fairport Harbor had always liked to stand a little apart from the town, a worn sentinel on the lip of Lake Erie, with sandstone skin rubbed by wind and years. In the bright months, its round silhouette cut a steady, reassuring shape against the water. In the grey months, it folded into the horizon like a thumbprint pressed into a page of cloud. People said the light had eyes, the lens that once watched the water, the keeper's lanterns that had warmed rooms where men mended charts and drank coffee, the quiet balcony where the world looked smaller and nearer all at once. The lighthouse that visitors climb today sits where other towers have stood, each one a memory of something rendered useful and then made obsolete. The most familiar tower, the one carved of dressed sandstone and capped with a lantern room that gleamed in a salt silver sheen, was finished in 1871. For more than 50 years, that round tower and its red brick keeper's house watched the mouth of the Grand River and the watery avenues of Lake Erie, focusing its beam through a third-order Fresnel lens, sending a steady note of light into the night for mariners. In 1925, the new breakwater light took over the job. The old tower's beacon was extinguished, and its metal lens now lives inside the small museum that grew up beside the tower. If you ask local children where ghost stories come from, they will nod as if the answer were obvious. From old places whose echoes keep returning until someone listens. In Fairport Harbor, those echoes gathered in the lighthouse's stone, in the mortar joints of the tower, in the wide windows of the keeper's house, in the cellar where boxes had been left. People talk of footsteps when no one is walking, of a thin, searching light that answers no conversation, of a presence that slips between rooms at closing time. The most famous of these tales, the one that folds into the building's name the way ivy folds into brick, is the story of the grey cat. The cat story is tidy, the sort of thing that news crews like because it balances the ghastly and the whimsical. While installing an air conditioning unit or doing renovations, accounts vary. The museum archives hint at summers of labour and slow restoration. Caretakers found the mummified remains of a grey cat tucked into a cavity of the tower or hidden in the rafters, depending on who is telling the story. After the discovery, the museum's curators and volunteers spoke of a persistent glimpse of a grey shape moving where no animal could be. The curators themselves, steady, practical people who know the difference between rats and superstition, have sworn to having felt eyes upon them in the lamp room, and to having heard the powder-soft jingle of a collar in a room where no collar hangs. The tale lodged itself into the town's imagination, and even made a feature of a televised show about haunted animals, and now the lighthouse is as much the house of the ghost cat as it is a repository of charts and glass lenses. But ghosts in Fairport Harbor are not only cats, and not all of them are soft-hearted. The Great Lakes can be merciless. The lighthouse's job was never sentimental. It was a life-saving geometry, an authoritative punctuation point against a gull-scratched sky. There were shipwrecks. There were nights when the wind came in walls and collapsing seas rubbed the harbour like a file. Men and boys who tended the beacon learned to respect weather as an enemy, as patient and inevitable as rust. Tragedy is the practical side of maritime history, and the tower kept those records in the way stones keep moss. The story I want to tell is not a straight recitation of dates. It is the story of one season, of people who loved and repaired this place, and of a night when memory and weather and the past met in a way that left the town different. It begins in late autumn, when the ferrymen had already called the season over, and the bright summer flags were folded into trunks. The air had a brittle edge. Leaves came off the inland maples like pages torn from a book. Visitors had strolled the green knoll by the tower at noon, but now the hill was empty, and the lighthouse looked inward, into its own radiance, with a kind of patient melancholy. Evelyn Hart had come to Fairport Harbor that fall, as she came every other year, to sit for a week in the low house by the lighthouse and to help the Historical Society catalogue photographs. Evelyn had a small, blunt pen that wrote like an anchor. She made lists, and she had come from a town inland and far from the lake, where winters meant mud and short light, rather than the lake's great sweeping horizons. She had lost someone the year before, a brother who had drowned in an estuary where the weather had turned sour and fast. She came because she thought being near a lighthouse might sort her grief into a shape she could look at. On her first morning, she climbed the narrow, worn steps into the tower and found the lamp room greeted by glass so clean that the light from the pane cut the shell of the world into panes: water, sky, horizon. The Fresnel lens was no longer in the lantern. It lived downstairs now, behind a display glass where a placard explained its order and its reach. The lens had been a marvel of light engineering, a spiral of glass, like a coiled shell that took meager oil or gas and fed a language the lake understood. She read the placard and thought of how something so precise had been replaced by a pragmatic breakwater light, and how villagers had rallied to save the old tower from demolition decades earlier. The town had loved it in that practical way. Small towns love old things. They wrote letters and signed petitions. They went to the right doors at the right time and made noise enough to spare the shape. Evelyn liked to work in the museum itself, cataloguing photographs and the creased sepia letters of sailors. The Historical Society's small office smelled of paste and dust. Near the radiator, on a shelf behind the desk, there was a small grey cape folded into an envelope with a label that read only "Keeper's Cat," and no one knew for sure what that label meant. A volunteer joked that the caretakers had always kept a cat. A docent told Evelyn, half joking and half solemn, "The cat is the lighthouse's conscience." Evelyn laughed politely, and then, with the soft, private absence of someone who is listening to her own thoughts, she set to work. Night began with the legalistic murmur of wind and with the church bell from town striking in the distance. Evelyn had supper in the keeper's house, a bowl of potato soup, the kind the volunteers made and passed to whoever needed one. And then she wrapped an old blanket around her shoulders and read the letters out loud. The letters were from men at sea, a shorthand scrawled in a cramped script, the kind that saves ink and perhaps breath for other things. There was one letter, folded small and saved in a sailor's wallet, that spoke of weather, came up in 10 minutes, and of a favourite shoreline where a boy had learned to sail. The man's handwriting wavered toward the end. Evelyn read the sentence twice before she realised the last line had been added in a different hand. "If I do not return, tell my sister I loved the harbour more than I feared it." She held the paper as if it were a fragile bird. After she closed the museum and turned off the lamps, she walked outside to the balcony, where the old keeper had once stood and tended the light. The lantern room's glass framed the lake in a globe of cold, and the horizon was a long black seam where the sky had laid down its hand. The wind made its habitual complaint through the tower joints. Evelyn thought of the line about loving the harbour, and of the way men had always loved the water that sometimes killed them. Then, as she was moving down the steps, she heard a skittish sound, a light, dry padding at the doorway, as if paws had moved along the threshold and brushed the mat. She turned. There was nothing but the breath of the cold air and the whispering of grass. She smiled to herself, the private smile of someone who has lived with loss and chooses, just for a while, to be amused by small, impossible things. That night, in the small, dark hours, the storm came. It was not an idea of a storm, but a literal live torrent, announced by the lighthouse in the same way all storms announce themselves, in places where weather knows the human patience. With a sudden lowering of the sky, an inward folding of light, and then the sound, wind like a species of living chain link, and rain that struck horizontal, that tasted like metal and meant business. The radio in the museum's office crackled with the voice of the Coast Guard. There had been a mayday call, a single and panicked voice that one of the local tug captains had heard between static, then nothing. The Coast Guard dispatcher read coordinates and an outline of the route where the boat had been seen. It was a small craft, a trawler that should have been closer to shore, that had evidently been in trouble when the weather turned. Volunteers and a small rescue team gathered, as people gather in towns used to the informal commerce of danger. The lighthouse, with its stone teeth and old bellows of wind, felt the emergency like a hand on its spine. Evelyn wanted to help. She put on the raincoat she kept for such things and went out into the night as men and machines and engines began to assemble in the harbour's mouth. The volunteers told her to stay back, to watch from the high ground. She watched because that is what she knew how to do, to be the witness to small, brave things. The rescue detectives fanned out. A searchlight sliced through rain. Boats were low and pushed hard by the lake's appetite. For an hour, the volunteers did what they could. Flares, a shout now and then, a directional beam that swung and swung. Then, in a moment that is recounted in many tones in the logbooks, with bluntness, with superstition, and with a kind of grief that is practical, something like a silhouette came into the light. A broken hull, half submerged, with a wet sail wrapped like a rag. The bodies were recovered quickly. There was no time for ceremony. The names were read later, the records filed, the community's sorrow arranged into its tight, public shape. One of the men who died was young. He had a name, but on that night the name seemed insufficient, and so the town said simply, "a boy," as if naming him would call him back. He had been the son of a dock worker, a boy who loved the harbour like a dog loves a particular field. In the days after the storm, the volunteers set up a little memorial on the hill beside the lighthouse, a candle or a ribbon at first, and then, because small towns turn grief into objects, a wooden plaque with his name carved carefully on it. His photograph, grainy, laughing into a summer light, found its way from phone to board to museum wall. The placard's letters were painted in a child's steady hand. After the tragedy, when the wind became a background instrument and the bright things of the harvest had been shelved, people said, in the little circles of their kitchens and back porches, that the lighthouse had been quieter for a while, as if the tower itself were taking a measure of its loss. But they also said the tower had not been empty. People reported small things restarting in the night, a footfall on the landing when no one was there, a lamp that had been turned off glowing faintly in the windows, the cat that, in photographs, sometimes seemed to throw a long, expectant eye into a corner. It was at this time that the town stories took an angle they had not had before, the idea that the lighthouse was still watching, not only the water, but the places where the living made mistakes. Evelyn, who had always been skeptical of supernatural talk, had another experience that season. One evening, she was cataloguing a batch of postcards in the hushed room that used to be the keeper's sitting room. The cards were from the early 1900s. Ships, men leaning on rails, and a view of the lighthouse in a snow that looked like ground sugar. Evelyn's hands smoothed paper while a kettle hummed in the kitchen. She was alone. Outside, the lake was a low, distant rumble. She had the radio on because she liked to have the news playing softly. The segment was about the town's plans to fund the museum's heating system, a story about budgets and grant applications. Between segments, the radio offered local music, an old ballad that used to be played on harbour nights. The tune was a small and perfect thing, a lament in 6/8 time that was about love and about moving on. Evelyn felt something, an ache she did not yet know how to name, rearrange itself like a hand unfolding a map. Then she heard, clear as a bell and impossible in pickup, the sound of a collar's small jangle. It wasn't loud, nothing to make anyone run, but it was there, the soft, precise, domestic noise of a pet moving in a house. Evelyn looked up from her cards. The The door was closed. The windows showed only the lake, black and flat. She stood, the hair at her arms lifting. She walked into the stairwell that led to the cellar. The steps were stone. Her shoes made no sound in the hush. On the landing she found, not a real cat, not a living creature, but the outline of a shape in the lantern glass, as if something small had just brushed by. The glass fogged slightly where her breath had met it. She placed her palm on the cold glass and felt the tower's stone under her hand, like the bones beneath the skin. "You found us," she murmured. Before she realized why she had said it, it was not an explanation, it was a recognition. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn became the person who looked for the grey shape. She found a trove of small things in corners, a few strands of grey fur trapped in an old beam, a faded toy mouse in a drawer, a tiny brass bell. The bell hummed faintly if she turned it and listened. She sat with the bell, shut her eyes, and imagined the harbour in a season of laughter and of manual certainty. She felt, in her chest, an answer shaped like a bell's note, muffled and true. In some versions of the story, the cat had belonged to a keeper who had kept it through a winter when supplies were low and when the keeper's family sent letters with parcels of dried beef and wool socks. In other versions, the cat had belonged to the children of the village who left it a small dish under the keeper's window. In all versions, the cat was faithful. In all versions, the cat followed the light as if it too had instructions. When the cat's mummified body was found, careful people wrapped it and placed it in a small case, and the case went into the museum drawer next to other artifacts that recognized the continuity between life and the small domestic things that keep it stable. Evelyn grew into the live place between times, cataloguer, comforter, small-town confidant. People brought her letters from sailors' families. One woman handed Evelyn a photograph that showed a man with a wide smile and a peacoat collar turned up against the wind. "He was my father," the woman said, voice narrowing into water. "We remember him by the lighthouse." He used to say it was a friend Evelyn placed the photograph where the museum kept such relics and felt the museum's old air, the same air where bell notes and a cat's memory lived, rearrange itself into a sequence of named lives. Other hauntings began like small, private complaints and turned into communal law. A volunteer who spent the night in the keeper's house reported hearing the careful, arrhythmic tap of knitting needles in a room where no one knitted. Another said that, late in winter, they saw the lantern room's balcony hold a shadow that was not tied to any human frame, a small lean of someone looking out at an impossible distance. People told each other these stories at the dock and in bar rooms, and the stories accumulated the way shells accumulate on the shore. Plenty, and each one a little different. Evelyn, who had once believed that ghosts were simply metaphors that humans used when they could not name grief, came to see a different possibility. One night, during a storm that felt like a congregation of weather, she went up to the lantern room and stood facing the lake. The room was full of a living light. The glass showed every blade of rain. For a long time she stared, and then, softly, she heard a murmur behind her. Not words, but a kind of close domestic sound like someone folding a blanket. She turned and saw, in the glass, a silhouette. Not sharp, but the impression of a small seated form that matched all the stories of the grey cat. She felt a presence, patient and indifferent to her need to name it. "Have you been keeping watch?" she asked aloud, ridiculous and intimate both. There was no answer, not in words. But the air shifted, and the bell on the museum's shelf, the small brass bell that lay in a drawer because it had been too delicate to display, rang as if struck by a small, invisible paw. Evelyn laughed then, a brief, astonished sound that was half grief and half recognition. She walked down the tower steps in the rain and found, by the museum's back door, a single paw mark, traced in the wet dirt of the path. Not the full smear of a cat, but a hint, an imprint like a note left in the margin of a book. That winter, when the museum closed for a few weeks and the lighthouse stood in a sleeker, fiercer light, the townspeople said they had never felt the tower's loneliness as much as they did. People came to the foot of the hill, and they left the house candles burning in windows to make the place less empty. The museum's annual letter asked for funds to replace weathered mortar and to insulate the keeper's attic. The local women's club volunteered to sew protective covers for the artifacts. The small domestic business of the lighthouse, mending, cataloguing, remembering, became the town's way of affirming that places matter because people keep them. Years later, after Evelyn had left Fairport Harbor and then come back for other reasons, for reunions of volunteers or to help catalogue a new gift to the museum, she sat at the table where the logbooks had been kept and read an old entry. It was a short note made by a keeper in the late 1800s. Storm tonight, boat seen but not found. Cat kept me company. The handwriting blurred at the last letters as though the pen had trembled. Evelyn folded the book with care and placed a ribbon upon it. She thought about all the ways people have made sense of danger by placing a story along its edge. The lighthouse's story had been practical and civic, technical and necessary. The town had organised petitions and letters to save the building, and the light had been replaced by a newer sentinel on the breakwater. The practical leg of the tale required no ghosts. But human beings are not satisfied by mere function. We press stories against the cold, rational outlines of utility until something warm forms. The ghost cat, the bells, the paw prints, such things are the human part of the lighthouse's life, the way we let a building's history become intimate. As for Evelyn, she did not leave grief behind. She collected it, catalogued it, and then found ways to place it in a public ledger, the way others place rocks and flowers on graves. She left a small donation to the museum's conservation fund the year she moved away, and she asked the curators to carve a note into the museum's ledger. It read, "For the ones who watch." She added no name. The curators put the ribboned book back in its drawer with other items that could be read aloud and be understood by people who needed to place themselves in relation to the past. If you walk up the Lighthouse Hill on a summer evening, you will find a sign, a few benches, and the museum's doors open to the sound of children's shoes. You will look up at the lantern room, and the stone will have the gentle stoic look of anything that has done its work and now rests. The town's plaque will speak politely of petitions and federal letters, as civic records do. The museum's small case will show the Fresnel lens with placard and measured facts. And if you press your ear to the cool glass of the museum window, though a docent will advise you not to, because touching the displays is verboten, you might notice faintly a small sound like a bell that has been struck from inside the tower. You might see, if your mind makes you generous, a small grey shape dissolve into the stone and then reappear on the windowsill as though to comfort itself or to remind the living to look after the small things. Ghosts in Fairport Harbor are less about the spooky and more about occupation. They are visitors of memory who insist on being remembered. They are companion presences that make places not merely historic, but inhabited. In the museum, a child once said aloud, after watching the lantern room's glass reflect a passing boat, "I think they're still watching." The adults laughed kindly, and then they looked at each other and did not say that the child was wrong. If you want a tidy moral, you will find it in the plaque that sits by the path. Communities fix what they love, and they pass their love along in rituals that need not prove anything to anyone but themselves. Or you can keep the other story, that in the shadowed spine of the lighthouse there is a small, watchful presence, a cat perhaps, who keeps vigil in the way pets do, ready to be there at the edge of someone's loneliness and to turn itself into an old, agreeable company. Either way, when the wind begins to gather into an impatience and the lake turns over toward its next mood, someone in Fairport Harbor will climb the stairs, look out over the water, and know what the place has done. Built a beam to send across the dark, held a memory until it could be told, kept the small domestic acts that make human life bearable. And if, on the balcony, someone hears the faintest jingle of a bell that belongs to no living pet, they will smile and leave a little light burning in the window. The past is not one thing, it is many small watches added together. The lighthouse keeps them all,